Welcome everyone to the Complex Trauma Institute and Michael Gilding's reflections on fear, anxiety and depression. This talk was delivered on Saturday as part of the City of York Festival of Ideas and is now repeating it online for a much larger audience. Michael can introduce himself in a few moments, but I'm just going to pass you over to Dimitri because of technical issues with this large audience. Okay, Dimitri?
Yeah, so hello everyone. Just a couple of things. So we have a couple of co-hosts, so we will be helping Michael. Um, First of all, please use chat if you want to ask any questions, if you want to pass questions to Michael. So we will be collecting questions and passing to Michael. We will post you link if you want to get certificate, because I realize some of you will want a certificate. So wait until the end. So we'll post you how to get certificate. What else? This is a meeting, so because we have so many people joining, means your camera on, but you choose. You can put camera off, on. Yes, and that's it. I think that's all. So just leave any questions. So we'll be assisting you, while Michael talk. Thank you. So over to Michael now. So Michael will introduce himself. Your floor.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Gilding. I've worked as a counsellor and a psychotherapist for almost 30 years, including over a decade in the NHS, where I ran the local primary care counselling service. I retired as a therapist last year, but I've been still providing training for therapists on the fear system, both through the Complex Trauma Institute and independently. What I'm offering here today is something I've been trying to understand for the last 10 years. It's an attempt to weave together strands of knowledge about fear from different areas and disciplines, including my personal experience, my therapeutic training, and those aspects of neuroscience and human biology that I've been able to understand. The presentation takes about 1 hour, 20 minutes. But there'll be 3 interludes where I'm going to ask you to join me in some simple breathing and posture exercises related to what I'm talking about. And it will also be an opportunity to switch your brains off for a few minutes. I want to start by thanking 3 people who made this talk possible. I've been very fortunate to have had Una McCluskey of the University of York as my clinical supervisor for many years. She introduced me to the concept of the fear system and a method of working with it, and set me off on this journey. When I first proposed my ideas on the nature of depression that you'll hear today, Jonathan Egan of the University of Ireland in Galway was hugely encouraging, introduced me to relevant research, and ensured that I didn't give up. And Dmitry Karpuk of the Complex Trauma Institute, who you just heard from, has both challenged me to develop my thoughts and has constantly supported my work. I'm hugely grateful for the help that these 3 have given me. Right, I'm just going to share screen now. So this year, the theme of the York Festival of Ideas is the power of. So I'm going to be reflecting on the power of fear. And I'm going to start with just a quick summary of my thinking. Firstly, the basics. Our fear responses are triggered when we sense a threat, and they switch off when the threat has passed and we have a sense of safety. However, when our environment is not safe, we can get stuck in what you might call fear mode for long periods of time. I think that being stuck in fear mode is perhaps the chief cause of human misery and is responsible for anxiety, depression, the vast amount of what is termed mental illness, and also a great deal of what we think of as physical illness. Which leads to the next point, that we think of mental health and physical health as if they were two completely separate things. They're not. And when we think that way, we put on a set of blinkers that stop us understanding ourselves. And the way we think about mental illness is damaging. With depression, for instance, we tell people that they're wrong in the head, or they have a chemical imbalance in the brain, which comes to much the same thing. When the real problem is the environment in which people live or have been living, and the threats that that environment poses or posed. Focusing on the individual being sick diverts attention away from the social and political action that's necessary to make our community safer for all its members. I'm going to argue that depression is a collapse of energy production throughout the body, which is an automatic response to threat. It's a physical collapse that also shuts down key brain functions controlling our ability to think and our ability to socialize. The big question is, how can we free ourselves from anxiety and depression? I don't think medication is the answer, though medication can give temporary relief, which may be necessary. Neither is counselling and psychotherapy the answer on its own, though therapy can play an important part. The alleviation of anxiety and depression is highly complex, and many different factors may need to be addressed, many of them outside of the scope of counselling and psychotherapy. But nothing is more important than establishing a place or a sense of safety. Just going to stop share here. Now, I'd like a bit of feedback on what people are hoping to get from this talk. So we've chosen 12 of you logged in today at random. And in a minute, I'll call your names out and we'll enable your video and microphone so that I can talk to you. I'm kidding. But what I'd like you all to do is to close your eyes and check out what happened in your body just then when you thought you might be asked to speak in public. Did you notice any of these sensations? A faster heartbeat, holding your breath, tensing up, going hot or cold, dry mouth, sweaty palms, feeling sick, legs going weak, frantic thinking, mind going blank, dizzy or faint? Do send a thumbs up if you felt any of those. These sensations are fear system responses. They're muted versions of what happens in the body in life and death encounters, such as those between a predator and its prey in animals, or in humans in, say, a car crash or a violent assault. So at this point, I want to ask you all to do something. Don't worry, it's very simple. Can you all close your eyes again? And can you give all of your attention to your breathing? Simply notice the cooler air you're breathing in and the warmer air you're breathing out. Just a few breaths in and out. Stay with that for a moment. Now notice the rise of your chest when you breathe in and the fall of your chest when you breathe out. And stay with that for a moment. And open your eyes. So that was a calming exercise, a brief taster of one of the simplest of the many ways to help manage fear responses. Let's look at these responses. The human fear system consists of our body's oldest responses to threat, oldest in evolutionary terms. And there are three different responses. Firstly, a collapse of energy production evolving 500 million years ago that makes a prey animal appear dead to a predator. I call this fear collapse. Secondly, a sudden huge burst of energy evolving 400 million years ago, making a prey animal suddenly stronger and faster so that it could escape being eaten. I call this fear arousal. Thirdly, alongside both these responses, another one developed that prepared the body for the massive changes of fear arousal and fear collapse while evaluating the danger. I call this response fear alert. Let's look at these the other way around. Fear alert is triggered when we sense danger at a distance. We don't know what it is or where it's coming from, so we scan the environment and our body's ready for extreme action. This response is commonly known as the orienting response. Fear arousal is triggered when danger is close. The predator has started its attack, but there's still a chance of escape. A huge number of changes happen in the body. This response is commonly known as fight-flight, but there is more to it than that. And fear collapse is triggered when the danger is so close that there seems no escape. The predator has seized its prey. In humans, it's likely to activate most powerfully when a state of terror is combined with a feeling of being trapped. That's why it's experienced frequently in the case of rape. This is also called immobility or the tonic immobility response. So we have evaluating the danger and preparing for action, fear alert. Huge energy boost to escape from danger, fear arousal. Sudden energy shutdown, the last chance saloon, fear collapse. I'm going to show some video clips of fear arousal and fear collapse in animals. Now, sometimes I find that when I stream this material on Zoom, sometimes it works okay. Sometimes it streams really slowly and an awful lot of the detail is lost and you'll just see slight changes from one to the other. I'm going to, in case that's happening for you, I'm going to describe what's happening as we go through the video, but I also recommend afterwards looking at the full videos that these are coming from, and you'll find these on my website. And I think Dimitri is going to pop that onto the chat. So if the videos don't make sense to you, just log into that afterwards and you'll have the full detail. So in this first clip, we see an antelope in fear collapse having been caught by a cheetah. But there's a hyena comes and it chases the cheetah off because the cheetah's exhausted and the hyena is about to rip into the antelope's stomach. But the cheetah's too close, so the hyena has to chase him off. Now watch the right-hand side of the screen carefully. And you see the antelope go immediately from fear collapse into fear arousal and escape, gets away. And in this next series of clips, a leopard has caught an antelope, and the antelope is in fear collapse. You can see the open eyes there, and the flop of the neck when the leopard lets go. But the leopard gets chased away by baboons, who are not fond of leopards, and baboons are no threat to the antelope. So here we see the antelope lying in a state of collapse, but this is now a safe place. And after a few minutes, these are just very brief clips taken out. Can you see the abdomen starting to rise and fall? We've got the start of a deep, spontaneous breathing. And after a bit, that turns into a shuddering. And in the full video, this goes on for a minute in the full video, going then into a sort of milder shaking for a bit. And then all of a sudden, the antelope is just off and away. These examples show the two main ways that the fear system switches off. In the first example, it's an unsafe environment, but a window of opportunities open up when the predators are confronting each other. The sudden switch back to fear arousal enables an escape to a safe place. Then the heart rate can come down, muscles can relax, and a state of calm is reached, and the fear system switches off. In the second example, the environment is already safe. The animal emerges from fear collapse by deep, spontaneous breathing, followed by a period of shaking, which deactivates the fear system. You might be thinking, this is about a bunch of animals. What's it got to do with me? Well, firstly, humans are animals. And secondly, we all have exactly the same biological fear system as the animals in these videos. Anyone affected by violence, sexual abuse, or a major accident is likely to have gone through the same physical responses as these animals. And all of us will be very familiar with more muted versions of these responses in our daily lives. So how is the fear system activated? Here's a chart of the autonomic nervous system. That's the part of our nervous system that operates automatically whether we like it or not. Fear alert and fear arousal are triggered by the brain's threat center, the amygdala. And the body's energy system is boosted via the sympathetic nervous system, seen here in gold, going from the brain stem via the spine to all the major organs of the body. Fear collapse is also controlled by the amygdala, which then shuts down the body via the dorsal vagus nerve, which we see here in red, going from the brain stem directly to all the major organs of the body. And how is the fear system restrained or switched off? You'll also see in blue on the diagram a newer part of the autonomic nervous system that developed with the emergence of mammals. The American psychologist and neuroscientist Stephen Porges calls this the social engagement system, and it's crucial in the emergence of animals whose survival depends on living together in social groups. Stephen Porges points out that it's impossible to live socially without being able to restrain the fear system, and this is the key function of the social engagement system. The part you see here, going from the brainstem to the heart and the lungs, is the ventral vagus nerve, which is possibly the key mechanism for switching off our fear responses. The social engagement system has its control center in the cortex, the newest part of the brain in evolutionary terms. When the environment is perceived as safe, an electrochemical signal is sent to the heart via the ventral vagus nerve. It connects directly to the heart's inbuilt pacemaker, the sinoatrial node. The default setting for this pacemaker is a fast heartbeat of around 90 to 100 beats a minute, right on the boundary between fear alert and fight flight. However, when the social engagement system signals safety via the ventral vagus nerve, this overrides the default setting and allows the heart rate to slow down to around 60 beats per minute, calming us down and switching off our fear system. The ventral vagus nerve is connected at the brainstem to the nerves that control the muscles of the face, neck, larynx, and inner ear. These are the muscles with which we communicate to each other whether we are safe or unsafe to be with. We communicate this by micro movements of the face and posture of the neck and tone of voice. So if we see a clenched jaw or a slight snarl and hear a raised voice, the signal on our ventral vagus nerve is switched off. So the restraining brake is taken off and our heart rate can now shoot up to allow our fear system to meet the threat. However, if we see a smile and hear a calm tone of voice, the signal on our ventral vagus nerve is activated. The brake's back on. Our heart rate calms and our fear systems switch off. Fear responses switch off. Now, I've talked about a 3-part fear system and a 3-part autonomic nervous system, but I need to clarify, they're not the same thing. The 3 parts of the fear system, ramping up in terms of intensity, are controlled by 2 parts of the autonomic nervous system. And the 3rd part of the autonomic nervous system switches off the fear response. So what happens in the body in the different fear responses? Starting with fear alert. What's going on? When we sense danger, but we don't know quite what it is, we usually keep very still so as not to be spotted and hold our breath to be able to hear better. Our heart rate rises and our hearing, eyesight, and sense of smell become more acute so we can track the danger. Also, our startle response is heightened. There's 2 bits to this. First is that the signal in the nerves which control the muscles of the arms and legs is increased, so there's plenty of power to move off quickly. And the signal in the ventral vagus nerve, remember that one, is switched off. So the body is in a volatile state where it's ready to go straight into the extreme action of fight and flight with nothing getting in the way. The main thing we notice in fear alert is holding our breath and our tension. Our thinking capacity is entirely focused on the potential threat, and we feel on edge and wary. On a day-to-day basis, we might notice fear alert going into a room full of strangers, standing up to speak in public, or hearing an unfamiliar noise if we're alone in the house at night. The important thing about fear alert is that it saves energy. Fear arousal uses up a huge amount of energy. If prey animals such as antelopes went into full fear arousal every time there was the slightest hint of danger, they'd all be lying exhausted on the ground at the end of the day, and their predators would just need to stroll up and collect their food. So fear alert provides a checking out state where the body is readied for extreme life-saving action, but there's no big commitment of energy. So we can very quickly revert to a calm state. And that's a key point, because if we can look out for the sensations of fear alert in ourselves or in anyone we're trying to help, we can quickly get back to calm and avoid going into fear arousal, which could take the best part of an hour to recover from. All we might need is a slight movement of the body just to break the tension and a deep sigh. And we step back from fear alert. Moving on to fear arousal. I'll start with the response everyone has heard of, fight and flight. Once a danger is close, the brain's threat center, the amygdala, triggers a huge number of changes in the body through the release of hormones and via the sympathetic nervous system, remember that was gold in the diagram there, with the aim of surviving by running and fighting. An immediate release of adrenaline causes the heart rate to shoot up and the chambers of the heart to expand, which increases the volume of blood pumped with every heartbeat. When this happens, we can experience a sudden upward surge of energy with the heart pounding in the chest. You may be familiar with this if you can remember the last time you really lost your temper. A series of cortisol-based hormones are produced, which trigger the release of glucose and other nutrients into the bloodstream from storage cells throughout the body. The blood supply to the muscles is increased, and we are now hugely stronger and faster than we were a few seconds ago. The blood supply to the gut and other non-essential areas is shut down, so we might have a feeling of nausea. We might also break into a sweat, which is the body's mechanism which prevents overheating in this high energy state. We sometimes notice that our mouth goes dry. This is caused by the release of the hormone vasopressin, which acts to retain water in the body so that any blood lost through injury can be replaced. And at the same time, the brain releases powerful painkillers so that the pain of injury doesn't get in the way of escape from danger. You'll all have heard accounts of soldiers in battle who can be shot or seriously wounded and they don't even notice it till afterwards. That's how powerful the numbing effect of fear arousal can be. Finally, the amygdala shuts down a lot of activity in the cortex, the newest part of the brain. So our thinking ability is hijacked. We can only focus on danger, and we start viewing other people as a threat. But there are further stages to fear arousal. When we can't run or fight, we go into freeze like a rabbit in a car's headlights. This is a picture of a Himalayan marmot a couple of seconds before its death, having been ambushed by a fox. You might have seen it before as it was the winning photo in the 2019 Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, but it perfectly captures the state of freeze. Freeze is the fight-flight response put on hold. What happens in our body is exactly the same as fight-flight, but with no clear escape route. Muscles lock and they're held in a rigid tension, which can then result in trembling. This is what we mean by shaking with fear, and it's a very different thing from the trembling we saw on the video earlier, which was the fear response switching off. And medically, these often get confused. Because our alarm is not being channeled into action, I think this state feels far worse than fight-flight. And the pounding heart is such a powerful sensation that many people experiencing this turn up at A&E departments fearing that they're having a heart attack. If an escape route presents itself, we can instantly switch back into fight or flight. But if there's no escape, our heart rate might peak in fright. This is the tipping point into fear collapse. Our mind goes blank, our legs go weak, and we start to feel faint. Fear collapse triggers when the fear arousal has failed and death seems imminent. The body goes into shutdown. So what's happening? It's triggered by the brain's threat center, the amygdala, and powerful painkillers are released into the bloodstream that induce drowsiness and numbness. The dorsal vagus nerve, remember this one colored red in the diagram, triggers a sudden drop in blood pressure by widening key blood vessels, which is also what happens in a faint. This means that all the cells of the body, the muscles, brain, gut, major organs, are starved of oxygen and nutrients. Now, the supply of oxygen and glucose is what enables every cell to produce the energy it needs to function, a process called cell respiration. When blood pressure drops and this supply is cut, every cell is de-energized. So there's a collapse of energy production throughout the whole body. It means that the muscles lose their tension and stop working. The newest part of the brain, the cortex, shuts down, which disables the control systems for thinking and for socializing. Then an older part of the brain, the limbic system, which controls our emotional responses, also shuts down. The full activation of fear collapse means that a prey animal suddenly collapses and appears to be dead, lying limp and unresponsive on the ground, often with the eyes open, as we saw in the video clip, and showing little signs of breathing. This physical collapse serves as a key survival strategy because it stops the predator's attack, and this can then open up a window of opportunity for escape, as we've just seen. One thing to reflect on here: if we should have the misfortune of being attacked by a large wild animal, there's a likelihood we wouldn't feel pain and we wouldn't feel afraid. The African explorer David Livingstone was attacked by a lion and described the experience of having his shoulder clamped in a lion's jaws as follows. It caused a sort of dreaminess in which there was no sense of pain nor feeling of terror, though quite conscious of all that was happening. This starts us off thinking about what fear collapse feels like in the human body. We experience it as a downward drop in energy or a sinking feeling. So whenever we have a real sinking feeling, particularly a sudden one, it could well indicate fear collapse. We feel faint, our posture slumps, and our muscles feel heavy as lead. Our eyelids feel heavy and facial muscles droop. We can experience numbness, which dampens our emotional responses, along with a sense of unreality, a sense of being out of the body. We might feel nausea as the gut shuts down, and we might lose control of our bladder or bowels. As we descend into fear collapse, thinking slows down and eventually ceases entirely. Our ability and also our desire to be social is also gradually paralyzed. We lose the ability to make sense of the non-verbal cues, and we can also lose the ability to pick out the human voice from background noise, so we can't properly hear, process, or recall what's being said to us. And finally, we lose all emotional responses, including our sense of fear, and we move from feeling faint and lethargic into physical collapse. Those who have been involved in serious accidents or have suffered violent assault or rape will very likely have experienced a full fear collapse. I believe, however, that most of us are familiar with less extreme forms of this, and I'm going to be arguing that low mood and depression are experiences of fear collapse. So far, I've described these three aspects of the fear system as if they were separate static states. However, in real life, they can be very fast moving, switching from one state to the other, just as we saw in the antelope video. Here's an example from Jeanette Winterson's autobiography, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? She's describing a real setback when trying to trace her biological parents. She received a letter containing a cursory bureaucratic response to her application. Applicant should fill in the usual form and refer back. This is what she writes. I sat on the back step, looking at it over and over again, like someone who can't read. My body was slight shaking all over, in the way that you do if you get caught in an electric fence. I went into the kitchen, picked up a plate and threw it at the wall. Applicant, usual form, refer back. It's not a fucking credit card referral, you asshole. And what happened next makes me ashamed, but I'll force myself to write it. I wet myself. I don't know why or how. I know that I lost bladder control and that I sat down on the step soiled and wet and I couldn't get up to clean myself. And I cried in the way that you do when there's nothing but crying. So here we have fear arousal response, showing first as freeze, the shaking, switching to a fight outburst, throwing the plate, followed immediately by fear collapse, physical collapse, and in this case with loss of bladder control. Now, let's pause for a couple of minutes and have a rest from listening, switch our brains off. And let's play about with posture. If you have back or mobility problems, just completely ignore anything that I'm saying. But otherwise, could you all stand up and shift your weight from foot to foot? Just move the weight from side to side. Roll your shoulders backwards a few times just to get rid of any tension and tiredness, and then roll them forward. Now, sit back down. But what I'd like you to do is to slightly slump in the chair. So droop, shoulders down, head drooped. Just hold that posture a minute. And check out your mood. What are you feeling like? Now, with both feet planted firmly on the floor, sit upright. See if you can get yourself a nice straight spine so your head feels well balanced, shoulders back. Take a deep breath right down into the stomach. Hold that posture for a moment. Check out your mood. What do you feel like in your body? Did you notice a difference in mood? Which do you prefer? Let's move on. We've looked at what happens in our bodies when different fear responses activate. If they can switch off once the threat has passed, there is no subsequent trauma, no ongoing problem. However, when fear system responses can't switch off, this causes a huge number of problems. Our fear system evolved from the conflict between prey and predator, and in that context, most attacks or chases don't last long. Within a few minutes, the prey is either dead or has escaped to a place of safety. So our fear system is not designed for prolonged periods of activation. And where there are threats that last for, say, over an hour, without a place of safety being available, the fear system itself can start to become dysfunctional. The very biological mechanisms that can switch it off start to fail, and we can be left in a state of chronic fear activation. So that's what I was referring to right at the start of my talk when I said that much human misery derived from being stuck in fear mode for long periods of time. The key factor is safety. If there is no place of safety in the aftermath of a serious threat, the fear system cannot switch off. Remember the first video of the antelope that got away? This is what this episode would look like on a graph. The antelope would have started in a place of calm and gone into fear alert when danger was sensed, and then into fight flight when the cheetah attacked. At the moment of capture, heart rate would peak in fright, followed by an immobility collapse. Then once an opportunity for escape arose, there was a sudden switch back into fight flight, and the antelope escaped to a place of safety where it could rest until a state of calm was reached. That's what it looks like when the fear system can switch off. However, when there's no place of safety in the aftermath of a threat, the body can't calm, and the fear system doesn't switch off. And this is illustrated in my next graph. The first part is identical to the previous one. However, in the absence of a place of safety and calming, we remain in fear alert. In this state, the nervous system is much more volatile, and even less serious threats can trigger further states of arousal and collapse that again only resolve into fear alert. In this way, an ongoing cycle can be established, a roller coaster effect, which can repeat continuously at any indication of threat, whether it's serious or not, whether it's real or imagined. Now, animals can get stuck in fear mode, but they don't last long in the wild. We humans are more likely to get stuck in fear mode, and I'll mention 3 reasons why. Firstly, we are highly social beings and we're dependent on the care of others for many years, so rejection or abandonment by those closest to us is sensed as a life and death matter and activates our fear system just as powerfully as a life-threatening physical attack. We are born with our fear system fully developed, but the mechanisms for regulating it require years of nurture to become fully capable. As babies, we rely entirely on our parents or other caregivers to regulate our fear responses. And they do this by being attuned to our needs, responding quickly to cries of distress, meeting our needs, calming our fears. Over time, this trains and strengthens our social engagement system. We learn to regulate our own fear. We learn to seek help from others when we need it. However, those who suffer neglect, cruelty, violence, and abuse in childhood don't develop a social engagement system that can switch off fear. And there are actually few of us who haven't experienced failures of care from parents or other adults responsible for our care, who are overstressed, unsupported, angry, anxious, or depressed because of the general state of the world that we live in. Lack of timely and attuned care leaves us with a less well-developed social engagement system, more vulnerable to further social blows such as school and workplace bullying or relationship difficulties, and this leaves us more likely to get stuck in fear mode. The second reason why humans might be more likely to get stuck in fear mode is because our thinking ability has developed to the point that we can imagine the future and all possible dangers. What we imagine triggers our physical fear system responses, but we cannot fight or run from dangers that are not actually there in the present. So the physical mechanisms that reset the fear system are not available to us, and we stay trapped in fear mode. Thirdly, the human race has a history of violence, warfare, oppression, persecution, the exploitation of the poor by the rich, and poverty caused by greed and inequality. And this has gone on throughout recorded human history, impacting generation after generation. We are all part of that history and scarred by it. And whether genetically or through failures of nurture, we inherit fear systems that don't easily switch off. We are a traumatized species, and we don't notice it because it's our normal state. It's what we're used to. The impact on us when our fear system is chronically active, when we're stuck in fear mode, is huge. It has a detrimental effect on our psychological well-being, our physical health, our patterns of behaviour, our patterns of thinking, our ability to relate to others, and at a collective level, our ability to function as a society. In terms of psychological well-being, which we could also describe as emotional turbulence, we can map the states of distress we get into on this roller coaster of the unregulated fear system. Let's just add in the different aspects of fear arousal: fight, flight, freeze, and fright. Now let's superimpose more familiar terms on these fear states. So here we have anxiety, a state of being stuck in fear alert and constantly being triggered into fight-flight. We see the fight response reflected in uncontrolled anger or rage, while freeze and fright are more familiar to people as panic. Where fear collapse is triggered, but the ventral vagus nerve, this one here, is still providing some regulation, we can experience low mood, a state where we can function fairly normally, but as our body cells start to de-energize, each task takes more effort than it normally would. The more that ventral vagal regulation weakens, the more our energy drops. And this, I think, is a mechanism which underlies our experience of depression, which can vary from mild to severe as fear regulation weakens further. I'd like to explain how I came to see depression as belonging to the shutdown part of the fear system. About 10 years ago, I came across Peter Levine's book, In an Unspoken Voice, which introduced me to the idea of physical collapse as a fear response. I started writing a conference paper updating the fear system model that I and my colleagues had been using. In the process of writing, I had an experience of exactly the same immobility response I was trying to write about. I had a bout of food poisoning, which involved an early morning rush to the loo. And afterwards, I felt really faint and I collapsed onto the bathroom floor. And I lay there, unable to move a muscle. My eyes were open. I could see the pedestal of the hand basin just in front of me. But my mind, which is normally constantly active, was a complete blank. Absolutely nothing happening. I had no sense of time. Parts of my bare legs that were on cold tiles didn't feel chilled. Then suddenly something shifted. I got up and went back to bed. And checking my alarm clock, I discovered that I'd been lying on the floor for about 30 minutes. There was no fear trigger to this collapse, but that same shutdown mechanism is activated not only by fear, but by many other factors posing a threat to the body, such as bacterial and viral infection, poisons, exhaustion, blood loss, or serious loss of liquids, as in this case, with diarrhea. The experience of this shutdown sensitized me then to a number of social interactions involving a drop of energy, such as shame. And I started to wonder whether depression might be connected to fear collapse. When I suggested this to colleagues at the conference, there was general agreement. In fact, it seemed fairly obvious once it was stated. Previously, I'd never been clear about what depression was, despite working with it for decades. And in this, I was not alone among my therapist colleagues, and the medical profession was no clearer. Some of the doctors at the GP practice I worked at saw depression as a chemical imbalance of the brain. But Johann Hari, in his excellent book on depression, Lost Connections, claims that this theory has no evidence base and was a successful fiction disseminated through drug company marketing. The symptoms of depression are clear: low mood, low energy, a slowing of thought and movement, a loss of both the ability and the desire to socialize with others. Other symptoms such as loss of concentration, negative thinking, loss of pleasure and interest in activities follow on from these. But the symptoms don't explain what depression is. However, as soon as you put depression's key biological markers alongside those of fear collapse, you see the parallels. The slowing down of cell respiration in fear collapse mirrors the drop in energy in depression, with physical collapse showing in depression as muscle weakness. The shutdown of cognition in the cortex in fear collapse relates to the slowing of thought and loss of concentration of depression, while the shutdown of the control system for social engagement results in this loss of the desire and ability to socialize in depression. I was left with a question, however, which puzzled me for a couple of years. Can fear collapse be experienced as a gradual continuum as well as a sudden physical shutdown? Because if so, that would then reflect the various stages of depression from mild to severe. But how does this work? I eventually found an answer to this question after writing to Stephen Porges, who I've mentioned previously. He sent me a pre-publication copy of an article he wrote with Jacek Kolacz, which referred to the fact that the signal on the ventral vagus nerve, which shuts down the fear system, is weakened if it's withdrawn for too long. So when we get stuck in fear mode over long periods of time, the brake becomes less effective at restraining our fear reactions. The metaphor that occurred to me that made sense of this was that our fear system responding to threats was a bit like a barn door flapping in a strong wind. Let's look at this first in the context of the fear system functioning well. If I superimpose this metaphor onto the roller coaster of the fear system, we see it responding to threats by oscillating between fear collapse and fear arousal. Here's a real example. A friend told me recently of being hit by a car when cycling. She experienced everything slowing down as she went over the handlebars. She was even had the time to picture herself in hospital, but she had no fear, and she hit the road without feeling pain. Friendly people helped her to feel safe at the roadside. She noticed her legs were trembling. Her fear system switched off with no subsequent trauma. Here's a made-up example. You're walking your dog through a field of cows and they turn on you and chase you. You let the dog go, run for your life, and you jump the fence like a gazelle. Now you're safe. Your heart's pounding, but your fear system has done its job and you're gradually calm. The ventral vagus nerve now comes into play. Once we start to feel safe, it activates and shuts down the fear system. In this metaphor, the ventral vagus nerve is a bit like a spring on the hinges of the door that can shut the door. In other words, shut the fear system off. When the signal is strong, it's like a spring with full tension that can keep the door shut. Threats that are not life and death will not activate the fear system. Here's a couple of examples. You've applied for a promotion, but just been told that you haven't been shortlisted. That has an impact. There are a few downward wobbles, but you don't collapse. You think, it wasn't my day. I'll have a go next time, another go next time. Or someone says, the boss wants to see you right now. Your heart does a little jump. There are a few upward wobbles, but you don't get too agitated. You take a breath and think, I wonder what that's about. I'll go and find out. However, when the signal has weakened because we've been stuck in fear mode, I imagine that the ventral vagus is like a spring that has lost some of its tension. So it can't properly keep the door shut, and less serious threats, like more moderate winds, keep it swinging into fear collapse or fear arousal. However, as the spring does still retain some tension, we don't see the extremes of fear arousal and fear collapse as we did with the bike accident and the cows, but we see intermediate states. If we've been stuck in fear mode and we hear that we haven't been shortlisted for promotion, our mood might really drop. We might lose confidence and think we're not good enough, we'll never get promoted, and we might end up going through a patch of depression. Or when we're told that the boss wants to see us immediately, our heart might start beating faster and we might frantically start thinking, what have we done wrong? And imagine we're going to get the sack. So we go into the boss's office in a state of anxiety. So as I understand it, depression is an intermediate state of fear collapse, and anxiety is an intermediate state of fear arousal. And I see these two as two sides of the same coin, being the most common manifestations of the fear system which has become stuck in fear mode and can't switch off. And when that happens, we're on an emotional roller coaster that can take us through anxiety, rage, panic, low mood, and depression. But there's much more that goes wrong. Being stuck in fear mode also has a huge impact on our physical health. It can cause chronic physical illness, cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, frequent viral and bacterial infections, chronic pain, and chronic fatigue. It can lead to the development of long-term behavioral patterns of self-neglect, self-harm, self-criticism, social avoidance, violence, and all the various kinds of addictions. It can shut down our ability to learn and benefit from education. It has a disastrous effect on our ability to make and sustain relationships. Fear-free relationships are equal, supportive, companionable. Fearful relationships are unequal, one partner dominant, the other submissive, both seeing the other as a danger and trying to control them by coercion, intimidation, violence, or by trying to please and manipulate. At a societal level, the unregulated fear system has created the cultures that we're born into, shaped by the violence, power imbalance, and suffering of the past. When levels of fear rise, societies focus on danger and find it in any sort of difference, be it race, nationality, tribe, class, gender, religion, sexuality, or political affiliation. Those who are different are seen as the enemy rather than as fellow human beings. And so the pattern of abuse, discrimination, oppression, persecution, and war continues into future generations. If you'd like a more detailed account of this, because I've had to skim through at huge speed, together with the sources that I'm relying on, you can download my article, What is Complex Trauma?, from my website. And I think Smitri will put that on the chat. In this article, I argue that complex trauma is this condition of being chronically stuck in fear mode. I think complex trauma is far more common than we think. We associate the term with debilitating symptoms that shut down functioning. But I'd refer to those symptoms as severe complex trauma or complex PTSD. In its milder form, I think complex trauma is the normal state of humanity. It doesn't shut down our functioning, but it stops us living fully, and it leaves us prey to anxiety and depression. So I'm going to go back to my previous claim that stuck fear responses are perhaps the chief cause of human misery. I'm using the picture here that I used to advertise the talk. My thanks to my nephew, Oliver Pitt, a gifted illustrator, for allowing me to use it. For me, it powerfully captures a sense of humanity stuck in fear mode. It conveys anxiety, depression, a sense of being trapped, a sense of being diminished, a sense that we are a traumatized species. when we're stuck in fear mode, we're living half lives. Our energy is depleted and we lose our creativity and our joy in life. We don't take up our full posture or our full space in the world. We close the door on opportunities that life presents us with because we're afraid of change. We don't approach others we're drawn towards because we fear rejection and humiliation. And because we're so focused on what's going wrong, what we can't do, how awful we feel, we're unaware of our surroundings, the amazing world we live in, and the amazing people we share it with. When our fear system manages to switch off, anxiety and depression vanish. And the most striking thing about that state is how much energy we then have, how much sheer vitality. We become immensely more productive and creative. We become much more sociable. We notice everything around us. We feel strongly connected to others and to the natural world. We recover our sense of joy. We're nearly there, but we need another short break. So let's stand up again and shift weight from foot to foot just to wake our bodies up a bit and roll our shoulders backwards and forwards. And maybe sway from side to side just to get our bodies working again after sitting too long. Now sit again, but let your posture slump. I want you to try a type of breathing that will inflate you and recover your posture. So just watch what I'm doing and I'll describe it. And then I'm going to do it again. And I'd like you to do it along with me. So it starts with taking in a very long, slow breath through pursed lips, then breathing out very quickly, but not allowing your posture to collapse when you breathe out. So I'd start slumped like this and go. And just feel yourself brought up to your full posture. So try it with me. Allow yourself to slump like this. Long breath in through pursed lips. Quick out, but leaving your shoulders not collapsed. And maybe one more time. Just slump down, long breath in, short breath out. Try it again afterwards. Maybe try it for a bit longer than we've had time for. I find when I do, if I'm feeling a bit down and my eyelids in particular are feeling quite heavy, if I do that for a few minutes, there's a point where all of a sudden it's sort of like my eyes just go ping and they're no longer heavy and I can see clearly and I know I've come out of the collapsed state. So it's good exercise for waking yourself up and reversing the early stages of a mild fear collapse. So we talked about the fear system, what it is, how it works, the things that go wrong when it can't switch off. And the key question is, what can we do to free ourselves from the grip of unnecessary fear? First of all, medication such as antidepressants is not the answer. Medication can play a part, and I've worked with many people where medication provided a stabilization that made the therapy possible. However, as James Davies points out in his book Sedated, much research has shown that in prolonged use, antidepressants become less effective, can impair recovery, and may eventually do more harm than good. I would strongly recommend this book, which outlines the powerful financial forces which benefit from persuading us that we are ill and keep us as consumers of medication, rather than people who can change our world for the better. What about counselling and psychotherapy? I think it can play an important part in freeing ourselves from unnecessary fear, helping to lessen the impact of past trauma, and helping us to explore changes we could make, both to the way we treat ourselves and to our external environment. But therapy is not the whole answer. The more I came to understand the fear system, the more I moved in my therapeutic practice towards working directly with the sensations of the body in order to regulate fear and make change possible. And this helped me to see that much of what needs to happen is outside of the scope of therapy. The key issue is, how do we help the fear systems to switch off? But there might be many factors that are keeping it active. Some of these may relate to the external environment, and some of them need political answers. Some relate to the workplace. It can be an important task of therapy to examine what changes are possible there. But some factors that keep us stuck in fear mode are related to the long-term impact of fear on the body. When we've been stuck in fear for a long time, the tension of fear arousal never relaxes properly, and over time it builds into chronic tension. This keeps our diaphragm tense, which makes it harder to take deep breaths. So we develop habitual shallow breathing, which can help to keep the fear system alive, active. Even if we find ourselves in a place of safety, the body is too tense to use the mechanism for switching off fear that we saw in the antelope video, that is, breathing deeply and shaking. The release of chronic tension might well require quite a number of sessions of sports massage or acupuncture over quite a long period of time. We've seen that when we're in fear mode for too long, the signal on the ventral vagus nerve is weakened. However, any activities which stimulate the signal can strengthen it and thus be effective in reducing fear responses and alleviating anxiety and depression. There's much research that shows that physical exercise increases the signal on the ventral vagus nerve. Daily exercise, such as a 30-minute walk supplemented by episodes of intensive exercise, is the bedrock of a lifestyle that can reduce the symptoms of anxiety and depression. There's good evidence that a regular practice of meditation or yoga stimulates the signal on the ventral vagus nerve and alleviates the symptoms of anxiety and depression. I'm sure that the slowing down of breathing involved can play a part in this, but I'm also sure that isn't the full picture. A number of meditation practices, for example, give focused attention to sensations on all parts of the body. And I know that from my own therapy practice, there's a technique of helping someone to pay very close attention to the various sensations in the body connected with trauma for protracted periods of time, which can lead to significant release of tension and reduction in the symptoms of anxiety and depression. So the same effect can be seen as the same effect that can be seen as a result of a regular practice of meditation. Breathing is very important in the regulation of fear responses. When we breathe in, our heart rate rises, and while we're breathing out, our heart rate is falling. This means we can use breathing to slightly raise or lower our heart rate in order to help regulate our fear responses. If I'm in fear arousal, anxious or angry, if I take a short breath in and then a long breath out, and keep repeating this, my heart rate will gradually lower and I can come to a calmer and less fearful place. That's one of the reasons singing is good for you. It's exactly that same pattern of breathing. If I'm feeling energyless and a bit low, if I take a long breath in and a short breath out, just as we did a few minutes ago, and keep repeating it, then my heart rate will rise and I'll feel more active and my mood will improve. When our mind's not working properly because of fear, it can be very hard to remember whether the longer breath is in or out. So one of the very simplest exercises is just to slow the breath down with in and out breaths the same length. There are limits to what we can do with breathing, however. It won't work starting to practice breathing techniques when we're in a panic. Breathing exercises work best by practicing in periods of calm, with the aim of changing habitual patterns of breathing. But so much depends on the intensity of your practice. Let me give you an example. I worked with a young military veteran with a long history of trauma, including being in a vehicle blown up by a roadside bomb. He came to me because his wife had thrown him out because he kept losing his temper and shouting at the children. I started with the simplest exercise, just slowing down his breath. His breathing was very fast and shallow, so we gradually practiced lengthening the time of each breath until he could slow his breathing down to 4 seconds for each in-breath and 4 seconds for each out-breath. Then I proposed he went about this like a military drill that he was very well acquainted with, and not just once or twice a day, but 20 or 30 times a day, getting in a few minutes practice in every possible gap. There was then a gap of about 3 weeks before I saw him. When I did, he was beside himself with delight. His young son had wet himself, and previously this had been a key trigger for his rage because his own father had beaten him when he wet the bed. This time he didn't get angry. He just said, "Oh dear, let's get you cleaned up." And he described his son just looking at him with disbelief. "Aren't you going to shout at me, Dad?" I was delighted, but I was also a bit shocked, and I was disbelieving and wondered how long it would last. And having got what he came for, my client then finished at that stage. But 6 months later, his wife contacted me and told me his anger was still well under control and she could completely trust him to look after the children. That encounter really shook up my thinking, and it made me realize I'd just been playing around the edges with breath work. And this was reinforced for me when I went on a 10-day meditation course after my retirement. Now, this was a course that I'd avoided for a long time because it was so hardcore. 10 days of complete silence, no mobile phones, no contact with the outside world, no reading materials, no writing materials, getting up at 4 a.m. each morning with over 10 hours meditation a day. But the 10 days was a complete nervous system reset. I went there with my energy a bit low, a bit irritable and wrapped up in myself. I came back calmer, more present to others, more aware of what was needed around the house, and with so much more energy for getting on with the work I wanted to do. The combination of this experience and my work with the young soldier made me wish I'd known much earlier about the need for working intensively on the things that help to calm fear responses. But this raises the issue, how do we provide each other with the level of support that's necessary to maintain such intensive practice? And that's a big question for me at the moment. We've looked at the social engagement system as a key regulator of our fear responses. So one of the most powerful antidotes to anxiety and depression is friendship. We should value our friends, spend time with them, make new friends. I'm talking about real friends, people in whose company we relax, people with whom we can be our full selves, people we can turn to when we need help, people who share our interests, people with whom we can play. The poet William Blake wrote, "The bird, a nest. The spider, a web. Man, friendship." For us, our true home is not a house, but the company of friends. Johann Hari gives a wonderful example of the blossoming of friendship in a rundown quarter of Berlin, where a protest against rising rents and evictions brought together a hugely diverse group, including the gay community and Turkish religious conservatives, fighting for and caring for each other, and transforming what had been an area of poverty, isolation, and depression into one that felt like home. In such a home, we can relax and our fears subside because we have found safety. And of all the factors we have to consider when thinking about how to break out of fear mode, none is more important than a sense of safety. It doesn't matter what else we do, if our environment is unsafe, our fear system will not switch off. If we want to tackle anxiety and depression, we need to tackle lack of safety as a society. We need to tackle it in our local communities. A society with poverty and failing support services and gross inequalities is unsafe. And we need to stop medicalizing human misery and making out that anxiety and depression are problems of the individual, and start taking action together to try to create a society in which every person can feel safe. I've talked so much about the power of fear, but I want to finish with a story about the power of safety, the antidote to fear. In 1995 in Massachusetts, twin girls, Kyrie and Brielle Jackson, were born 12 weeks premature. They were treated in intensive care in separate incubators, as was the normal pattern then. Kyrie made good progress and gained weight, but her smaller sister, Brielle, wasn't thriving, and after a few weeks her condition became critical. Her heart rate became dangerously high, her limbs turned blue, and she struggled to breathe. All conventional methods of stabilizing Brielle were tried and failed. And the hospital staff and her parents knew that she was about to die. As a last resort, the nurse in charge broke with hospital protocol and put Kyrie into the incubator alongside her sister. And Brielle immediately started to calm, and Kyrie wrapped an arm around her. Within minutes, Brielle's vital signs stabilized, and the metabolic shutdown, which would have ended in her death, was reversed. For Brielle, her sister's closeness, warmth, touch, breath, and heartbeat was safety. Safety is not an idea, it is something viscerally sensed, and it triggers a biological system as powerful as the fear system. The power of fear is matched by the power of safety. We could also call it the power of love, but that's for another talk. Thank you for listening. We have limited time for questions now. We've only got 10 minutes left, and there are quite a lot of you. So I'll take one or two questions now. But if you could write any questions you have on chat, I'm running another session on Thursday, the 4th of July, just for follow-up Q&A from this session, from 3:30 to 4:30. And if you pop your questions on chat now, I'll try to answer as many of those during that session. If you can't make that time, don't worry, you'll be sent a link for the 4th of July, but you can access that link at any time of your choosing after the 4th of July.
Yes, Michael. So we have a few questions. I hope you will answer them. Well, I'm looking for questions. Number one, how does this model apply to autistic people?
Well, that's a very big question. It's also a question that takes me well out of my area of expertise. I think that the model of the fear system and the way that we're affected by the fear system applies in exactly the same way. But I think there are issues with the working of the social engagement system with autistic people that actually make it harder for the fear system to turn off, make them more vulnerable to stressors. And I think that there is a lot of what we do in psychotherapy that presumes that the social engagement system can be repaired in some sort of a way, even if it's not working as well as it should. And that presumption isn't correct with autism. I do think that, I think it's a very particular specialism for therapists, but certainly in the time that I've been working as a therapist, I would have always referred on to a specialist, but the number of people who now specialize in that is increasing.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I hope you can answer a couple more. Very quick one. Somebody want to clarify: is complex trauma you mentioned is it the same with complex PTSD?
I think complex PTSD is the high end, the severe end of complex trauma. The way I see it is trauma is what happens when there's been a threat, the fear system is activated, but because of lack of safety afterwards, the fear system doesn't switch off. So one is left with PTSD-like symptoms. But where you have a simple trauma, let's say there's not a big history of trauma. This is someone, a fairly well-functioning adult, and say a car accident happens, and you get trauma symptoms and nightmares and flashbacks and all sorts. You can actually work quite quickly with it using, say, a method like EMDR. And within a very short space of time, you can help the fear system to shut down, and then that's all sorted. Complex trauma is where and this is usually stuff that belongs to childhood or has been going on for a very long time, where there is no safety afterwards. There's then no safety, and then more things go wrong, and the fear system stays active for long periods of time, and then it really starts to affect the biological mechanisms that switch off the fear system. It starts to affect relationships. So there's just a wider and wider problem of things going wrong. But I think we can see it from sort of mild to really severe. And I think complex trauma is the human condition because we are born into a world of trauma.
So it's the same, complex trauma, complex PTSD.
Yes, basically
differently.
we're just talking levels of severity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next one. I was wondering how this model works with predators and abusers. Do they do the fear arousal or something different? How would you explain?
So how it works with
how
abusers?
Does it work with abusers? Yeah. So when
I think it's a particularly severe cases of being trapped in fear from very early on, and therefore always acting out of fear, or never having access to the social engagement system. So the thing about when you are in fear, you see the other as the danger. You see them as other. You see them as not like you. When you're operating that way, you're operating as an individual. not as a member of society. And I think that's a particularly severe sort of that.
So I see you doing well. One more. So, Michael, would you suggest that addressing cognitions, for example, in CBT, is superfluous to the treatment of fear arousal, and we could solely focus on physiological aspects? I'll translate. So, do we go straight away to physiological aspects, really? Is it superior?
I think working cognitively, I think there's a problem actually, because I think that CBT has been vastly oversold in actually quite a fraudulent way, as the panacea and the thing that can solve things. I think it's important. It was a part of my training, and I've always used it. But where I found it most important is, I think that we think the way we think because the body is in the state that it is. So for instance, when we're in a state of collapse and we've got very, very little energy, our body is saying, I can't. So our cognitions are saying, I can't. One follows the other. I see the body as primary and cognition as secondary. But let's say you're in fear arousal, the body is saying danger, the mind is saying danger. Then we can think in such a way that we actually ramp up our fears. We go into a sort of vicious circle. And cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective working in that area and actually stopping us from believing our thoughts, and sort of cutting that feedback loop where our thoughts can further alarm our bodies, therefore further alarming our thoughts. But there's a sort of continuum of all the things that need to be looked at, and the physical state, our inbuilt perceptions of danger are the broader part of the spectrum, and the cognitive bit is a small bit. So it's small, it's essential, but also some of the way that it works, it requires the thinking brain to be connected. The moment you are in fear arousal, your thinking is limited. The moment you're in fear collapse, your thinking is wiped out. So, that approach becomes ineffective. And when someone comes to see you and their thinking is absolutely limited on danger or is switched off, then you have to try other approaches. So you just have to, I suppose I see a therapist has two jobs. One is you help people to explore so that they can find out how to live more fully. The other is that you regulate their fear responses. But people can't explore if they're in fear. So you have two jobs. Do I need to regulate fear? Do I help someone explore? And the first job of a therapist is to work out which is it. And if someone comes when their mind's working properly and they can engage personally and they can think, great, you just sit back and help them explore and just cheer from the sidelines and prompt and that. But when they can't do that, then you forget about most of what you do in therapy, and the only thing you do is regulate. You sort out posture and breathing, and you just you have to work. And sometimes it can take weeks, months, years to get someone to a point where they feel safe enough being with another person for then therapy to start to work.
Michael, shame. We have many questions. It's lots of interesting questions. Practical one, maybe one more.
Okay. Yes.
Because just a practical, very practical one, and a lot of practical questions. So, how can someone who refuses to trust people make friends and find their safety? And there are many similar questions actually. So, what exactly we need to do to find safety? And
that is a huge question. That you can't do it easily. People are only going to start trusting when they have reason to trust. And because if people who have cared, well, if people who've been responsible for their care have been untrustworthy, why would they trust? So they have to have a new experience, but it's very difficult to have a new experience when you can't trust. So it just has to happen really, really slowly, and you have to work really gently, and you have to not probe, question, whatever, or be a danger. Sometimes it's like, you know, if you let's say you have a wild animal, and we're all animals, you know, so we're wild animals when we're in these fear states. You have to sit down beside a wild animal and look in a completely different direction and say nothing for ages, and just allow them to get used to you. You know, it's that sort of approach that we might need.
Yeah, just somebody next replied, it could be Tai Chi example of how to build safety, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to put up the QR code, Dimitri? Do you want to
No,
explain?
no, it's my. I
You're
forgot
talking
to
that?
say.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
forgot to say, and I will be sending anyway. So everyone will get email. So please expect
Right.
email from us. And
Can I just say, and I just want to quickly share my screen here. So I'll skip the feedback one. Yes, I like correspondence. It really helps me, you know, where if you think that I'm wrong, or you've come across stuff that you've read that I haven't mentioned here, I'd love to hear from you. And you'll find a lot of material about this on my website, michaelgilding.com. I'll stop advertising myself
so
there.
people keep asking, in order to get certificate, you need to complete very short feedback form, which is I posted. And if you don't worry, if you don't have time now, you will get email, yeah, with invitation if you want to attend and actually have a chat. Because next event would be just a discussion. I'm sure we'll have a lovely discussions, and you can bring your questions, and so you will get invitation and you will get a link that I've just posted, so you're not gonna miss, and you're gonna get a link where you can watch recording. So if you lost, you can wait for email, and please keep checking your spam folder, because often unfortunately emails go to spam. And just write to us if you need any help. So any other, thank you, Michael. Do you want to add anything?
No, thank you very much for listening, all of you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for your time, Michael. It's people keep saying thank you. I hope you can see messages popping up. People saying thank you. So yeah, pleasure to have you, Michael. Safe evening, everyone. Yeah, and everyone be safe. Stay connected to friends, and stay connected to us. We'll have many more events, everyone. Goodbye, everyone.